A very good evening to all our audience, in at home and around the world, as we come to you tonight again on our Monday night program. We want to thank Noah Singh for making this platform available, and of course, technical specialist. Today, as we begin our program, is a very important week in the religious community. As we know, the Hindus celebrate their activities this week. The Christians they are celebrating Holy Week. The Jews will be celebrating Passover this weekend, and of course the Muslims continue with the fasting. So it's really a great week for Guyana and around the world, if only we can be good to ourselves and to our fellow men. We want to thank all of you for tuning in and for being part of what our sponsors also. We want to say thank you so much. This evening, we have our guest, no stranger to the Guyanese community. We have known this gentleman for years. He's been part of GECOM. He has been part of the University of Guyana. And tonight is our pleasure to welcome again one of the commissioner of GECOM, Mr. Vincent Alexander. Mr. Alexander, welcome again to the program.
Thank you very much.
And of course, my co-host, Dr. Rose. Dr. Rose, welcome.
Thank you, Charles, and welcome, Mr. Alexander.
Thank you.
Mr. Alexander, in your view, and I know if I ask all the commissioners of GECOM, they might have a different view, but in your view, what is the state of GECOM today as we speak?
Well, as you should know, we are going through a process of continuous registration, a cycle of continuous registration. And that's proceeding at a pace, but we have had some, I would say, some little administrative hiccups in the process. I don't think that we have necessarily done enough work in terms of training of our staff. And so that has caused some problems. And they are faced with some challenges because we have a system that is now responsive to the issuance of birth certificates in the manner in which they were not previously issued. And so a number of issues are arising in that process. But all in all, the process is ongoing and the numbers are not bad. Though I don't think that we have done sufficient work in terms of the advertisement, we unfortunately are at a point where we are almost halfway through the process and we still haven't done the normal infomercials to make the public aware of the exercise. But that notwithstanding, the numbers are not looking too bad. So it's not ongoing, but could have been better organized.
Okay, thank you. And I know with the new CEO in place, I mean, and we have seen, we'll talk about the advertisement in the program, but how is the staff and the new CEO, are they coordinating activities to your satisfaction, or things should be done a little differently?
Well, you know, people bring their own styles to a particular job. And one of the things the CEO has done, GECOM does not have a public education or a voter education manager at this point in time. And what the CEO has done is, to a very large extent, taken that onto himself, even to the point where the role of the public relations officer has been reduced. And I think that that has resulted in things not being done as expansively as they can be done, because when one person seeks to take on all of this work, obviously it can't be done as quickly. And for example, in the past, infomercials are prepared prior to the commencement of the exercise and are aired once the exercise would have started. we are in a situation where the exercise has started, it's gone a far way, and we really haven't done infomercials. And what's the reason for that? The CEO says, well, he is waiting for pre-qualification of persons by the National Tender Board before he can actually engage agencies to do infomercials. Now, I think personally that that is not the right approach. If you're going to be pre-qualifying, you have to do that in the prior year. So as soon as the year starts, you can get the work done. But if, in our circumstance, he had gone out to advertise directly, we could have gotten to infomercials much faster than we're presently doing. And I have the fear that we may be well through the exercise and still not have infomercials, which to me are the most powerful of our media in terms of making the public aware of what we're doing.
And when you speak of commercials, you're talking about what?
Infomercials, these are TV advertisements and radio advertisements.
And what does it relate to the public?
What does those
infomercials?
That we have registration. It tells the public what is required to be registered, who can be registered, where you can go to be registered, all of the pertinent information that would empower an individual to access the process.
And that is not being done in the way it should be done, you say?
The infomercials, there are some newspaper ads. I'm told that there are public address systems going around, but I'm saying that there are no infomercials, which for me, in my view, are the most powerful tool we have used in the past to make the public aware of the exercise and the pertinent details.
And I agree with you, because I think as a CEO, you need to use all the avenues available to you to get your job done. And if that is one avenue, I know social media has been a great source of information these days. So maybe GECOM, I don't know if the CEO is doing that too, using the platform of social media to tell the public, what is going on. But I agree, every option should be used. Now, Mr. Alexander, I know you did not vote in favor of the CEO because you had your own views, and you were, I think you were more receptive to the gentleman out of Jamaica. But in your view, since the CEO has come on board, is there anything that he has done to transform GECOM into a more open organization where the public can have confidence in it?
I don't think that any such thing has been done, really. In some regards, the CEO came on board and one may say rushed himself into continuous registration and has not lent to doing anything that's new or novel. It's kind of following the old way of doing things, and in some regards doing it his way. So things that could be done to make a difference have not been done. For example, I called for and was supported by most of the commissioners for a review of GECOM's operations during the last elections as a basis for going forward. There was agreement in the main that, yes, we should do that review, but there are those who felt that that review should wait because we have to do registration now. Whilst it was my view that really you shouldn't be going forward with anything unless you have fixed the system. You have identified the flaws and sought to correct them.
And you're talking about from the registration to the election day, or you're talking about what transpired during the election day itself, or the entire process?
The entire process.
Okay, I got you. Because if it was election day activities, we can do both together and find out what went wrong, what can be done to correct it, at the same time continue with the registration. But isn't there a plan of action that the commissioner has put forward to the secretariat for them to implement? Because the secretariat don't work on its own, they work with directive from the commissioners.
The CEO did bring to the commission what was called the pathway to local government elections. And that pathway has two aspects. It has the registration aspect, which we are pursuing, and it did speak to how we would get to local government elections. There were those who felt that we ought to have done more work on the aspect that takes us to elections. We ought to have had more discussions, but the pathway was brought together as one document for one discussion. And so there is still the view that beyond the registration, there are matters which we should have discussed, that we have not necessarily discussed, which are critical to the realization of local government elections that are free, fair, and free from fear.
So, Mr. Alexander, if I can read you correctly, and our viewers, I guess, might have the same, opinion, is that GECOM is not a wheel turning with all the bells and whistles at this point in time. There's still a lot of gaps and ad hoc decision and so on going on without having a real plan of action that will bring clarity and bring cohesiveness to the operation of GECOM. Am I correct in saying that?
I wouldn't say there's no plan of action. As I said, the CEO brought plan, the pathway. But as we have gone along, we've had quite a few bumps along the way. We've had bumps in terms of where registration is being conducted. There were issues about that, separate and apart from the permanent offices. There were issues about the conduct of registration in temporary offices. We had to resolve that along the way. We've recently had the issue of whether we'll continue to do registration at schools for school children. We have suspended that. When we suspended that, there was a misunderstanding of what the decision was. And so for a day or two, registration was suspended at the school building. Even for people other than school children, we had to correct that. So we've had some bumps along the way. And the view is that, if we had taken some more time to be more detailed in our preparation, we may not have had those bumps.
It seems to me, before Dr. Rose come on, Mr. Alexander, is that the administration of GECOM is really scrambling to get their act together, when I think the basic common sense operation, what does GECOM do? Register people, put a plan of action for election. And I know I'm saying it out of ignorance because I don't know the details of it, but basically to get an election going, run an election and declare the result. How do you do that? There are different things to go in place, but I'm getting the impression that things are not smooth at GECOM at this point in time.
You are going to have problems if you don't have all of your manpower on board. We did not complete the recruitment process. We only recruited the CEO, and recently, the last meeting, the legal officer assumed. But we still don't have a deputy CEO. We still don't have an assistant CEO. We still don't have a logistics manager. We still don't have a voter education manager. So that means that the work is being concentrated probably in the person of the CEO. And it's not human for one person to be able to be most efficient and most effective carrying all of that burden.
But that problem lies squarely at the commissioners, not at the CEO.
That in fact would lie at the commissioners, and we have to take collective responsibility for that. But the fact of the matter is that there is some slothfulness which seems contrived in relation to doing the things I've referred to. So whilst we can't deny collective responsibility, I would say that if I had the final say, it would have been different.
Dr. Rose?
Welcome again, Mr. Alexander, and welcome to all our listeners near and far. Mr. Alexander, you are saying that a number of senior personnel are missing at GECOM. Now, registration is being taken place. This is not telling the public that GECOM cannot do a good job with all these people missing?
Well, with all the people missing, we certainly don't have the manpower to do the best job. And the absence of that manpower from time to time is being manifest. If we had somebody responsible for public education, then we may have done a better job. If we had deployed public education to the public relations officer, then we may have had a better job. In fact, I have proposed that in the circumstances of GECOM, there is no need for a public relations officer and a voter education manager, that those two jobs should be collapsed into one. But we have a situation where we have the PRO, but the voter education job has not been ferreted out to the PRO. Instead, the CEO has taken it on himself. When in the past, in the absence of a voter education officer, the PRO, including the present CEO when he was PRO, stepped into that role, but that's not the case at this time.
Mr. Alexander, from the last structures at GECOM, or from the last person at GECOM, how many people were removed from GECOM since the last election? Can you give us a brief title?
The CEO was removed.
Okay.
The DC was removed. The chief accountant has resigned. The personal assistant to the then CEO contract came to an end and has not been renewed. So we've lost somewhere in the vicinity of 4 to 5 persons.
Okay, let me ask you this question. If GECOM cannot manage its internal staff and have them there in place for registration, why would the public trust GECOM to run an election?
I'm not saying that the public should trust GECOM. It is desirable for the public to trust GECOM. But I don't think that GECOM has done all that's required to ensure there's that trust. And I think it goes beyond this question of the absent staff. I think that GECOM has lost the opportunity when we took the decision we took in terms of the person we appointed to be the CEO, without any reference to the person. Given the nature of Guyana, and given the fact that the DCO, former DCO, was trumped by a particular political party, good or for bad reason. Once he became CEO, that in itself becomes problematic in terms of the Guyanese population at large reposing confidence in the office. So I think we weren't smart in the way in which we approached the question of the appointment of the CEO. My own view is that, separate and apart from whatever concerns I might have had about the CEO's suitability for the job, that it was in our best interest to have someone who could not be identified with any partisan group as the CEO.
Based on what you're saying, let me ask you this question. Do you have confidence in the new CEO?
I have difficulties with the new CEO. I don't think he has all of the competencies that are required. And I dare say that if I'm called upon, I may well be able to identify things which have occurred which suggest the absence of those competencies.
In the last election, there was a registration list of 660,000 people out of a total population of 795,000. What that is telling the public. If you have 660,000 people registered to vote, this means you had little or no children in the country below 18 years old. Are we
Well,
going to
it's
do the same thing again?
going to get worse.
These bloated numbers?
It's going to get worse because we're doing registration, and there are people who are now age 18 who will be added to that list. So whilst there'll be no significant growth in the population itself, there will be growth in the number of persons on the register of registrants and the number of persons on the voters list. And so I am of the view that that's an issue that GECOM should confront. We are faced with a situation when we raise this issue, there seems to be some acceptance that it is an issue now, but we are told, that is not within the purview of GECOM. That requires legislative action, is outside of GECOM's purview, and therefore, in a sense, being told, leave it alone. But I'm of the view that GECOM ought to, at minimum, seek to influence the legislature, and the legislators to give some consideration to that problem, since it is argued that they're the ones who have to address and resolve that problem.
I want you to tell our listeners, what is the role of the chairperson? And is the chairperson conducting herself according to the constitutionally assigned to her as a role in the whole process?
The chairperson, from where I sit and from what the Constitution says, is the first among equals. That's the chairperson. The problems that I have with the chairperson is that the chairperson behaves judge-like. In other words, the chairperson does not get deeply involved in the discussions, interrogating the issues with the commissioners. The chairperson largely listens and very often presents to us what is called a ruling, so that you don't have a chairperson who is taking an initiative and challenging the commissioners along a certain path of action. You have a chairperson who behaves judge-like, and sometimes I find an element of contempt in that behavior, because I have seen situations where we are discussing a matter overnight. We have started the discussion, continue the discussion into the next day. At the end of the discussion on the next day, the chairperson reads a prepared judgment. And for me, that is very disconcerting, because why have big men and women sit and discuss a matter for 2 and 3 hours, and then you read a judgment that was prepared prior to that discussion? It simply means that you have not necessarily lend your ear to that discussion, that you have a predetermined position and judge-like rule. And what makes it worse is that very often the ruling is reflective. Over 80% of the rulings, if not 90, have been reflective of the arguments of one side of the divide.
Let me ask you a question. In your opinion, why she behaves like that?
Well, it might be partly because of her training. It might be partly because of her training, but even in that regard, she should not be writing a judgment before she's heard all of the arguments. And therefore, it may be that she has a predisposition to these matters, and that what we say doesn't matter that much. And one has to ask the question, what is the source of that predisposition? There are people who have a view about that.
Is she objective?
Particularly since the judgments seem to come down on one side of the divide.
Is she objective?
I cannot say that, because in my view, some of the pronouncements in the judgments have not reflected objectivity. For example, I go back to the question of the CEO. I could hardly accept the argument that the CEO met the requirements from the standpoint of experience, having been, prior to that, a PRO, and not having 6 years as a DCU when the advertisement called for 6 years experience at the level which would be equivalent to the level of the DCU. And what the CEO said, what the chairman said, was that she was influenced by the reference of the former chairperson in making her decision. The former chairperson who recruited by invitation that person to GECOM, and therefore may himself have been predisposed.
Do you think our voting record reflects what GECOM ought to be?
What you say?
Do you think our voting record reflects what GECOM ought to be?
For me, no, it doesn't.
Now, let me ask you this question. Mr. Norton, the new elected leader of the PNC and APNU, has called for her to step down. Do you agree with him?
You see, I have this difficulty sometimes of saying you know what you have, you don't know what you get. I do feel that his pronouncements are justified insofar as the conduct has not suggested that we are in a fully objective drive. But I don't think that his call has taken into consideration the realities of GECOM, how it's constituted, and what provisions there are for the removal of commissioners, including the chairperson. And what may be a better at this time is for the whole question of a review of the commission itself, rather than the chairperson. I think whatever happens as GECOM, there has to be collective responsibility, irrespective of the fact that you may not be you may not be someone who agreed with the decision which was made. There has to be collective responsibility. And therefore, one has to review the entire collective, how it's assembled, when one is making a judgment of the state of GECOM.
How do scrutineers are selected or perhaps hired to register persons?
The scrutineers are essentially agents of the parties.
Agents of the party?
Yes.
Okay. Now, this is a question you might be able to answer. In 1992, former President Jimmy Carter and company structured GECOM based on the 331 formula, and it was meant to be for only that year, election year. Now GECOM is using that same structure after 30 years. Do you think that formula is working, the 331 formula? And when I say 331 audience, 3 commissioners from each side, and the chairperson could break the vote or in either way.
It's clear that any system should be subject to an evaluation and a review. And that is what, in some regards, I called for. GECOM has not been subjected to that kind of evaluation and review, and therefore has not lent itself towards the correction of any deficiencies or flaws that might reside in the system. Indeed, 30 years is a long time, and there should have been a review. Not only should have been, there should be a review, both at the level of GECOM itself and the level of those who are responsible for the legislation that has created the GECOM that we have today.
What structural changes you would like to see in GECOM?
Ideally, we should have a commission that is not heavily weighted as it is by nominations from political parties. There are examples that we can follow. For example, the Jamaican example. It does not exclude the political parties. It probably provides them from time to time with a veto, but it allows the commission to make decisions based on commissioners who are not political appointees.
Charles,
so it doesn't exclude the parties.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Alexander.
It allows for a commission that has the involvement of the parties. It gives them from time to time a veto, but in the mainstream, decisions are made by commissioners who are not the nominees of political parties. We have a situation where commissioners have made it very clear that they're there to carry out the instructions of those who would have nominated them. That has been said unequivocally. So there isn't even the pretense that one should be objective.
Over to you, Charles. Charles, you're on mute. Charles, you're on mute.
Yes, sorry about that. I was mute because I had some noise home here. Mr. Alexander, thank you so much. We take a short commercial break and we'll come back as soon as we are done. Audience, don't go nowhere.
Announcing Curry Duck Curry Competition 2022 in Cancun, Mexico.
Hey, y'all take y'all eyes on past week? Last year, y'all take all my cousins to Punta Cana and slaughter them. I drink and sport up. Now y'all want to take another set of us to Cancun? Well, yes. And wait, now y'all taking Raymond Ramnarine, Terry G plus Tassa. Okay, y'all take Raymond, Terry, and the Tassa and go along your way.
Break it down, 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 ding. Break it down, down, ding. Break it down, down, ding. Hey yo, my sweetheart, say I'm addicted to you.
Make it a family and friends reunion. Curry Duck Curry Competition 2022 in Cancun, Mexico on July 28th to August 1st. For more info, call Globespan at 212-243-0865. In Canada, call 647-557-6200. In Trinidad, call Amerals at 645-1604. And in Guyana, 227-1701, or visit us at Globespan.com.
It's when this wedding got done. Right now my belly burning for the 7 curry. But them fancy people just call it vegetarian food. I just call it 7 curry.
Order your 7 curry or vegetarian box today from allfromonesupplier.com and get free shipping throughout the US.
जन्म जन्म का साथ है तुम्हारा हमारा.
Bollywood on the Beach is a family and friends event with Bollywood Entertainment. July 14th to the 18th, enjoy a 5 days and 4 nights all-inclusive vacation with your family and friends and your culture. Performers from India, Pakistan, Trinidad and Guyana will be live at the resorts with your favorite Bollywood songs. In Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. Stay in the family section or in the adults-only section and enjoy over 12 restaurants, 11 bars, 7 pools, play areas, spas, and exclusive beach area. Your all-inclusive Bollywood on the Beach vacation is from $1,095 per person, which includes your airfare, transfer, hotel, and all you can eat and drink. Make it a family and friends reunion in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. Flights available from all U.S. cities, Canada, Trinidad, and Guyana. For rates, date, and more info, call Travelspan at 212-243-0865. In Canada, call 647-557-6200. In Trinidad, call Amirals at 645-1604. And in Guyana, 227-1701, or visit us at travelspan.com.
Dave's West Indian has all of your West Indian groceries and items. They carry curry powders, pepper sauces, sodas, snacks, and much more. Dave's West Indian is the choice for West Indian items. Visit Dave's at 11808 Liberty Avenue or call 718-843-3283. And for Dave West Indian products online, visit allfromonesupplier.com for free shipping throughout the United States. Dave's West Indian is a proud sponsor of Travelspan's Curry Duck Curry in Punta Cana. Flights to Guyana have never been cheaper. Check out these non-stop direct fares from JFK to Guyana. One way from $150 and round trip from $344. From Guyana to New York, one way from $210 and round trip from $360. These are non-stop direct flights to and from Guyana on American, Caribbean, or JetBlue. These cheap fares will not last, so call Travelspan today. In New York at 718-845-0437. That's 718-845-0437. In Georgetown, call 227-1701. And in Berbice, call 337-4287. Folks, the Nest Restaurant is the place to dine for Guyanese and Caribbean dishes. It is the best restaurant in Queens. The staff is courteous, and Dave, the owner, is always there to welcome you. So for a memorable dining experience, visit the Nest Restaurant located at 12717 101 Avenue, South Richmond Hill. Go and make a reservation today, or takeout. Call 718-847-4035.
Welcome back to our audience as we discuss with Mr. Vincent Alexander, Commissioner of GECOM, what is going on there at GECOM. Mr. Alexander, before we went to break, Dr. Rose talked about the registration. Is this a house registration for a new voters list, or is it registration of new registrants only?
It is registration of new registrants and other transactions. So for example, if you have a change of name, you can do that transaction. If you have a change of address, you can do that transaction. So it is not simply for new registrants. It is for other transactions pertaining to the record in relation to those who are already registered. And it's not house to house, it's office based. There's something people seem not to understand. Their house to house and office based registration can achieve the same objective. It is just a different method. House to house means we go house to house and do the registration, which may otherwise be done with the registrant coming to the office and doing the exact same transaction. Except that in house to house, you're able to do a verification at the time of the transaction, whilst in the case of the office-based registration, you then have to go to the house after you have done the documentation to verify residency.
Right, and the point is, what is the purpose of the registration? As you're informing us now, is for new registration and to correct any anomalies or change of address and change of name and so on. So the existing list that we have, we are adding more to that list.
Let's put it this way. What we are working on now is the register of registrants. That's what we're working on, the register of registrants. So we don't have a vote, as we speak, we don't have a voters list. That is, life has expired. We have a register of registrants. And what we are going to do at the end of the registration is to cull from that register a new voters list. A new voters list which will include all of the persons on the old voters list, except for persons who would have been taken off of the register because we have received a record of their death. So all other persons who are on the old list can find themselves onto the new list because they continue to be in the register from which we cull the voters list.
And that brings to the question, Dr. Rowe's comment that we have 600,000 persons on the list with a population of 7 or 80,000. I am on the list, and I keep saying this. I am on the list. I live in New York, but I was registered there in 2011 because I went to the office in Collingen. Then they came and verified that I was living where I said I was living, and I'm on the list. So there are thousands and thousands of Guyanese who are on the list, but who have migrated. And that's the point I'm trying to get. The list of 660 does not mean that these persons all reside in Guyana. So there might be like 203, maybe 250,000 people on the list. I don't know, I might be wrong, of those who reside overseas. So the list is not padded. It's just that it's people, Guyanese, who are citizens there, have registered and have migrated. And that's the point. And I think that should be known by everyone.
Well, two things I want to say on that. There's a difficulty with that from the standpoint of what is referred to as cleansing the list based on the judgment handed down by the acting Chief Justice, who said you cannot remove persons from the register of registrants. However, prior to that judgment, there was a regulation under the National Registration Act, which provided for the Chief Immigration Officer to provide the Chief Registration Officer periodically with a list of persons who would have left the country and would not have returned over a certain period of time. The Chief Registration Officer was then in a position to not have those persons included on the voters list. However, the law also provided for those persons, if they came into the country, particularly at the time of elections, to put a claim and to have their names included on the list, so that the way the law was fashioned was intended to ensure that you didn't have people on the list who were going to be present, but to provide an opportunity for people who were entitled but off of the list to be included.
So why is that not happening? I mean, that seemed very simple and straightforward. Why is that not implemented?
The judge's rule said you can't take anybody off the register.
So I'm living in New York. I am on the list, and after this exercise, I will continue to be on the list, so I can come in 2025 and vote if I'm in Guyana, and I can exercise my franchise. I think that's why the list is said to be bloated, but it's not bloated because many of us who live overseas, our name is on the list. That's the problem.
It is not bloated, but the evidence suggests that once you have names on the list of persons who are not present, that list could be manipulated to have those persons voted.
Well, not Mr. Alexander, sorry to cut you off, but not according to what Mr. Lowenfield said. And I'm sure you listened to that clip. You watched that clip.
What Lowenfield said is what he said. But what the Chief Immigration Officer provided and what the Registrar of Boards and Lists provided suggests that Lowenfield is wrong. And I agree with that suggestion. So that Lowenfield is not my gospel. People who are in charge of systems tend to have an interest and to defend those systems. I am not wedded to what Lowenfield said. I'm wedded to my experience. one of the things I experienced in the last elections was a significant number of persons voting by affidavit. It means that they came and claimed that they had lost their ID card. But we have had a system for replacement of ID cards. But there were many people who were voting by affidavit. And therefore, in the review, I would like to see the number of people who voted by affidavit and to ask myself, why did that occur if they were issued with ID cards and if they had a facility to have a replacement? Why so many affidavits?
But the affidavit is not the problem, Mr. Alexander. The thing is, you have to sign that affidavit. So that affidavit, yes, that signature must be matched by the signature that GECOM have for me. So,
no.
Well, that should be in place. How can you know the same person signing the affidavit?
No.
Something is wrong with GECOM.
Then you sign the affidavit. They ask you some questions to determine whether you are the person, the real person, based on the information they have in the records. But let me say this to you. If I want to vote for somebody else, what would I do? I would sign the affidavit for myself, as if I don't have an ID card, and then use the other person's ID card to go and vote. And therefore be subject to
then they have to be collusion with the returning officer, which is appointed by you, Mr. Alexander. Anyway, let's get.
The return officer appointed by me.
GECOM, by GECOM.
I would make the argument that the evidence suggests that something went wrong.
Okay, all right.
So not because I appoint that person, I will now defend myself by saying it couldn't happen. I have to be sufficiently critical of the system to provide for improvement. I have made the point repeatedly that the problem GECOM has is the human factor. And you may have a polling station that is so configured in terms of the personnel that those things become possible in the face of an opposition or a government scrutineer, so to speak, who might be a minority and who may have concerns about what may happen to him or her if he or she insists on having people scrutinized in a particular way.
Okay, Mr. Alexander.
In the human factor, and therefore we have to move beyond reliance on the human factor. And for that reason, I am an advocate of the use of biometrics at the place of poll, and not biometrics determined physically, but determined electronically. So I feel that we need to have a mechanism at the place of poll where the person who comes to vote is identified biometrically through an electronic mechanism and removes the judgment of that returning officer and other human beings in the determination of that person's identity.
So it was scanned fingerprint or what is?
We already have a database with fingerprints and they can be used.
Okay. That seems fair to me. I agree with that. Now, Ms. Alexander, there are reports that the chairman of GECOM receives a salary of about $10,000 US and above. What is the salary of a commissioner?
I think that the chairman's salary is somewhere in the vicinity of probably $10,000 US, somewhere there or a little less. I'm not quite sure. The commissioner's flat take home is in the vicinity of $400,000.
So take home is 400,000. Ms. Alexander, you were given high marks when you administered the polls for the PNC, for the leadership of the PNC. Everyone think that you did an amazing job, and the polls was fair and free and everything else. What we can't reconcile is why Mr. Alexander support Mr. Lowingfield and Mr. Mingo when the whole world saw what Mr. Mingo was doing at the count at the, after the election?
When did Mr. Alexander support Mr. Mingo? Mr. Alexander has never made any statement in relation to Mr. Mingo. Never.
Well, it's not the words, but the action that was taken in that the procrastination that the PNC commissioner did when it was on the table to remove Mr. Lowenfield and Mr. Mingo. There was, in the view of the many in the public, that they were dragging their feet for them not to be removed. Is that a fair statement?
My position is, in the circumstance of Mingo and or Lowenfield, that there was legal action being taken. And in those circumstances, what one would normally do is not attempt to determine guilt at the administrative level, but to let the law take its course. And what people like those are subject to is an interdiction rather than a dismissal.
Were they interdicted?
They were not. They were
Why?
not. Because in GECOM, a decision of 4 persons determined that they should be dismissed.
Before the interdiction?
Never interdicted. Lowenfield, and in fact, they were not even dismissed. Using the word dismissed technically. These guys had their contracts terminated.
Terminated, okay.
And they were paid all of their benefits.
For the entire period of the contract?
For the period of the contract and for due notice termination.
And all by the backs of the taxpayer for,
yes.
Is that, do you think, is that fair for the Guyanese people?
What is fair is for them to have been interdicted, probably placed on half salary, for the court process to proceed, and for GECOM to finalize its disposition based on the pronouncement of the court.
Mr. Alexander, you've been a commissioner for many, many years now, and Dr. Rose is trying also to get that answer. What can GECOM do differently because let me be fair, what I heard during election day of 2020. The election was, in the view of many, was the perfect election. Everything went as planned. According to those who observed the election, those who watched it, we watched it, and everyone think it was the perfect election. What went wrong after the election that brought us to that 5 months of stalemate?
2 things I want to say. That indeed on the surface, it was the perfect election. But if one can unearth evidence, as was unearthed about people who voted who were not entitled to vote, then one cannot conclude it was the perfect election.
Can I stop you 1 second? Can I stop you 1 second there, Mr. Alexander? What percentage of people, or numbers, if you want to put numbers, that was in that category?
There were a significant number, particularly in view of the fact that the difference between the contesting parties in terms of the results was 14,000.
14,000 persons?
That's the difference between the 2 parties.
No. How many persons you are alluding to that voted that should not have voted?
The number that I saw in terms of the evidence that came from the registrar of births and deaths and immigrations are in the thousands.
How much thousand? How many thousand?
Are in the thousands. They could. I think I saw evidence for about 3,000 to 4,000.
But will that materially change the result of the election?
But that is no. You see, you asked the question as to whether things were perfect.
No, I know. And listen, you're saying that
I'm responding to that question.
Okay.
Of perfection or imperfection. We also had a situation where 47 boxes could not be legitimatized because during the course of the recount, the documents relating to those boxes were not available. And it meant that they had gone missing, not during the recount, they had gone missing during the delivery of the material to GECOM. We do not normally go to that material when counting the votes. We simply count the votes. But that material is a part of what's returned to GECOM and aids in accountability. From all evidence, the material never returned to GECOM. And it's rather funny that they all came from the same sub-district, so to speak. And that sub-district coincides with the area where questions were being raised about what Mingo was doing. So there were a lot of unanswered questions, and GECOM has not been bold enough to interrogate those things to get answers. And that is what I'm saying is required. Let's get the answers.
Mr. Alexander, I'm from some very confidential report I received, and many others I'm sure have gotten it. We were told that was a deliberate strategy from the APNU AFC in collusion with the assistant returning officer from that area to not to put those things in the boxes because they know that this thing will go to a recount, and when it goes to recount, they will claim that these boxes need to be disqualified because the information is not there. Now, if that is true, I don't know, but those were reports that we received.
The reports that I have received suggest quite the opposite, that there may be others other than the AP and the AFC who had an interest in those documents not being delivered. So that these are things that we have to investigate. These are things that we have to investigate.
Is that assistant returning officer still an employee of GECOM, the person who was responsible for that area?
There wasn't one person responsible for that area.
A couple of assistant returning officers?
There were deputy returning officers, and they spawned the area rather than being one person being responsible for that area.
But did the commissioner of GECOM call these persons in to find out exactly what went wrong or why it happened?
Whilst we were doing the recount, there was an initial call for those persons to come in. I'm not sure that they all came in, and unfortunately, GECOM seemed to have dropped the ball in pursuing the matter.
Okay, Dr. Rose?
Mr. Alexander, let me just follow up on what my colleague Charles have just said. What steps are being taken by GECOM and you, the commissioners, to prevent illegal registration, that people and absentee migrants voting, etc.?
I don't think GECOM has taken any particular steps in that regard beyond what GECOM has previously been doing. We have not reviewed our system to find out if there are flaws or deficiencies that we need to plug. We've continued to do things the way they were done before. And there are people who are quite comfortable with that. The government has essayed that it wants to introduce some changes through RUPA. And so from the government side of things, they've essayed they want some changes, but those changes are not related to the ongoing registration exercise. They're more related to things closer to the conduct of elections.
So we could have this process repeated itself again in 2025?
In my view, yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I was told that there are 3 polling clerks at each polling station, 1 polling agent, and 1 returning officer. Now, if those documents were missing up the East Coast, why were those people not charged?
The Lord in heaven knows that. Why were they not charged? I don't know. But other people were charged who were remote from those occurrences.
And also, as you know, each polling stations represented, maybe
what
not.
you need to bear in mind, you know, those charges were not as a result of any report that GECOM may have made to the police. Those reports came from other places, and those charges came from other places.
So
and there are those who have assumed that they are on the side of right and are themselves suggesting that they have to do what is required to clean the system up. You know, I heard the president, for example, when questioned on some of the things that he's doing, he said we have to get rid of the riggers first. We have to get rid of these people so that there isn't a standing back by the executive to allow the legal course to run its course. The executive has taken a position, and not only have they taken a position, but they have obviously taken action as well in pursuance of their judgment.
Now, if what you're telling me that the same system actually going to be operating again in 2025, then we might experience the same type of stalemates. So where are we going with this type of system? Why can't there be changes in the registration? Why can't there be changes in all these death certificates showing up, as you said, and allegedly people who are dead are voting and so forth?
There can be changes if GECOM can have a consensus. We do not have a consensus. The challenge is still before us. And with the idea I have, which has been tabled more or less at GECOM about using biometrics, then we will see who has an interest in changes and who doesn't.
What is that consensus?
I'm talking about the use of biometrics at the place of poll, that even with the list we have, can ensure that someone who is not physically present is not voted for. I think that will be a test of the sincerity of people about GECOM's system. So that the test is still before us in some regards. We may have failed some tests already, but it's not the final exam. The test is still before us, and we will see who has an interest in cleaning up things through the use of biometrics and who doesn't have.
What advice would you give to GECOM? No, sorry, what advice would you give to the government about making changes in GECOM?
Well, first of all, my advice would be that there should be a thorough investigation into the operation of GECOM in relation to that whole electoral process. An investigation which does two things, which seeks to identify if there are gaps and faults in the system, and which seeks to identify if there are people who may have perpetrated wrong during the course of the elections. I think GECOM owes it to itself to be involved in such an exercise. And when I say GECOM owes it to itself, I don't mean we the commissioners must do it. I mean that we the commissioners must identify a team of people whom we have trust in to come in and with our support to conduct that exercise.
Every government, past and present, always talk during election campaign time how they're going to reform GECOM and so forth, just like reforming the Constitution. But whenever they get into power, those issues just are being placed on the back burner. Do you think it's in the interest of any government, past or present, to make any changes in GECOM?
I would not comment on whether it's in the interest of any government, but I would say they haven't shown the interest in making the changes. So I don't know whether it's in their interest not to make the changes. I'm not commenting on that. But I would say that they haven't shown the interest in making the changes.
And why do you think that is?
It's either they think the system is working, and some people said it's worked, or they think the system benefits them.
Have you discussed any changes with the new CEO that you would like to see make at GECOM?
I have had no discussions with the new CEO, but I've certainly raised the question of the biometrics at the level of the commission, of which the CEO, for all intents and purposes, is aware of and party to. I have made other suggestions in terms of things I think GECOM should be doing, not necessarily directly impacting elections, but there has been slothfulness, a lethargy in terms of doing anything different. People listen to you, sometimes they agree with you, but you don't see the action to follow through.
In your opinion, could you tell our listeners if you believe or think that Mr. Lowenfield and Mr. Mingo contract should have been terminated?
I said previously that in my view, procedurally, they should, if there are question marks about their behavior, they should be interdicted, and the law should be allowed to run its course.
Or do you think there were question marks about the behavior?
There are question marks that have been raised about the behavior of Mr. Mingo, which ought to be dealt with. I do not have the same level of query about the conduct of Mr. Lowenfield.
You mentioned that the contracts were terminated and they've been paid for the rest of the contract. How many years are remaining on the contract?
No, they weren't paid for the rest of the contract. The contracts provided for termination with due notice.
Okay.
And what occurred was payment in lieu of notice.
Do you think that there are qualified Guyanese in Guyana with the requisite skills and experience to fill senior posts at GECOM, given the fact that you have stated that most of these places call for 6 years experience in voter registration or in GECOM exercises?
Let me respond to that 2 ways. At the level of the CEO, I think we are better off recruiting someone who's not Guyanese from overseas, at the level of the CEO. At the other levels, I think the GECOM makes it difficult by the years of experience they call for. I think those years are uncalled for. I think that people can come into the job once they have particular qualifications and some experience. Where are you going to get people with 6 years experience to be your DCU? Where are you going to get them from? So that is going to be manipulated, and it was manipulated, even for the CEO position.
Who is responsible for drafting those clauses to put in place?
They are determined eventually by the commission has to take responsibility for those things.
And because the voting went either way, the commissioners on your side did not win the vote.
I would say on the question of the 6 years, which I just referred to, it wasn't really one of the most conflictual situations, that by and large, eventually people agreed, all right, let it be 6 years. So we have to take collective responsibility.
Mr. Alexander, I have followed elections closely in all of the Caribbean countries, CARICOM countries, and they have never experienced the things being experienced in Guyana from GECOM. Are you telling me, or is this because GECOM is incompetent, or GECOM just don't know how to run elections? Because it does not happen in none of the Caribbean countries I can recall, not a single one.
I don't
Elections
think
are being
that
called,
the Caribbean
and the
countries
same night, in most cases, you get the results, they put it into the electoral system, the results come out, and the person, just recently in Barbados, the same night, Miyamoto was declared the winner. And in many other
I
countries.
don't think that one, in answering that question, could simply look at GECOM. GECOM, in many regards, is a microcosm of the Guyanese society, a society which is vastly different from the ones to which you are referring. And therefore, some of the problems that we encounter at GECOM are a reflection of the plurality, the antagonism in the Guyanese society. I think that is the crux of the matter. Barbados and Jamaica and those places are largely homogeneous societies. Things that happen after elections in those countries don't happen in Guyana. After elections in Guyana, people are fired left, right, and center. Does it happen in Barbados? So it's not a mere question of elections. It's a question of the plurality, the politics, and the level of antagonism that inheres in the very society called Guyana. GECOM is just a manifestation of those things.
Do you think there are political interference in the running affairs of GECOM?
If I think it's political interference, I think it's a political direction. I have no doubt it's political direction. Commissioners have said that their task is to ensure that the will of those who appoint them is realized. There's not even a modicum of distancing oneself from the political directorate.
So what you're telling our listeners is that GECOM is politically directed, but is this good for the country?
No, it is not good. Guyana's politics is not good for the country. Guyana's politics is not good for the country. Let me show you what I consider to be, the reality of Guyana. And I'm going to use myself as an example. I worked with a foreign entity on a contract. After the elections, the foreign entity was advised that the preference was not to have me continue work with that entity on the contract. Now, I was just a member of a team. I wasn't a decisive factor or anything like that, right? And in this one Guyana, I was denied the right of employment because somebody felt that Alexander shouldn't be employed. In a circumstance where what I was doing was inconsequential in terms of what the service provider would have delivered to the government of Guyana. That is our reality. I haven't kept nice about it because I know the reality of Guyana. In fact, I told the people that that was the most likely act that would occur. They doubted me, but it occurred, and I told them, well, I expected this. That's our reality.
This happened after the elections?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Mr. Norton, the leader of the PNC-R and APNU, has asked for the chair to step down. The PEP opposed to that. This means that we're in a stalemate. Where do we go from here?
Well, you call it a stalemate. I don't know. I don't think the conditions presently would take us in that direction. If the conditions change, it may take us in that direction.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question here, but it's a visionary question. GECOM has conducted elections since 1992. And this last time, it was the first time we experienced such a malfunction. So can we say that GECOM functioned relatively well? 92, 97, 2001, 2006, 2011, 2015. I know 2011, there were some problems there with a seat up in Linden, or 2006 rather. But GECOM in the last election actually did not function well. And this has impacted the voters and the country and has brought, I think, shame to Guyana. Now, do we or should we expect the same thing in 2025?
Let me respond to that this way. What was discovered in 2020 suggests that some of these things may have occurred even in the past and would not have been uncovered because we didn't have a recount that could reveal these things. That's one. Secondly, at the level of the CEO of GECOM, we know of CEO's interference in the results in 2006. We know of the CEO's attempt to produce a particular result in 2011. And so one may speak to what occurred in assumedly occurred in 2020, not as something necessarily new, if what occurred is claimed to have occurred, not something new, but something which was revealed. But in 2006 and 2011, and there are other instances of things that occurred. Let me give you an example. In 2011, I think it was, 2011, we took a position that we would not issue certificates of employment to persons who were working on behalf of their parties in polling stations if they did not belong to that polling station. And we discovered on election day that certificates of employment had been issued in not an insignificant number, but only to one party. And we had been told by the chief elections officer that no certificates had been issued. And I'm not speaking secondhand. I discovered at the Alexander Nursery School in West Rhinefeld that there were PPP agents who were able to use certificates of employment to vote. When in fact, GECOM had determined that we were not going to be issuing those certificates. When I discovered that, I got in touch with Linden, and there were about 50 issued in Linden as well. But no AP and UAFC officer got those certificates. So they were either not able to vote, or they had to leave the place of poll to go and vote where they were registered, which left a gap in the system. We have not done the kind of reviews to honestly determine the areas in which work ought to be done. And this is not related to 2020 alone. It's over the years. On the surface, things have appeared to have gone well. 2020 suggests to us that that is on the surface. And that if we had gone below the surface, even in previous years, we may have discovered some of the things which we discovered in 2020.
Based on your analysis, partially I should say, most of the problems that GECOM stem from its CEO in the past and the chair. Now,
in terms of elections, I would not finger any of the chairs. So I wouldn't finger them. But certainly we've had problems at the level of the CEO.
So how do we have a CEO that is, it's difficult to say free from political affiliation, but a CO that is objective and fair. Where are we to find such a person?
My preference at this time, publicly known, is that a qualified foreigner, preferably from CARICOM, should be preferred for that job, even as we attempt to do other things. Such a person should have been preferred.
All right, I think we're running out of time now. We quickly run out of time, but quickly, Mr. Alexander, you mentioned that the commissioners are directed by the political parties. I guess you're implying the PPP. Does it apply to the PNC commissioner as well? Are they directed by the party?
Let me answer that question this way. Undoubtedly, the PNC would tell the commissioners that they nominated what is their preference. Having said that, I, Vincent Alexander, has made it publicly clear that I'm a constitutional officer. And I am prepared to listen to what the APNU AFC has to say, but I am not prepared to carry out instructions outside of my own good judgment.
Okay, so both political parties give directive to their commissioners. So that's
I would say yes.
fact.
I would say yes. I wouldn't get involved in magnitude.
Okay.
But I would say yes. It's the nature of our politics.
Right. In terms of Region 4, which seems to be the biggest problem. In 2015, as you recall, Mr. Granger and his team went to see the chairman at that time and Mr. Lowenfield, and they were promised, I think, what a day or two after the election, that the results will be published, because they declared then that GECOM gets their statement of polls during either just after polls are closed or at least 48 hours after that. When did you receive the last statement of poll for 2020 election? Did you receive all the statement of polls?
You who?
GECOM.
I would presume that GECOM received all the statement of polls, but what I can say is that as commissioners, we were not in receipt of the statements of polls for the lower East Coast. And the reason why we were not in receipt is because some commissioners removed themselves from the process of receiving those statements because they thought that their purpose would be better served in District 4, where really there's no function for individual commissioners. So at the end of the day, we did not have a complete compilation of the results.
You're a member of, well, you are appointed by the PNC. Did you see the PNC statement of polls? Did they have it available
I had
to show?
no interaction with the PNC in relation to their statements of polls. None.
Okay, but Mr. Alexander, I know we're running out of time and running out, but you, Mr. Lowenfield submitted 3 different results of the election to the commission. And you are supportive, if I can recall, of the commission meeting and giving their blessing to those different results. Is that the true statement?
I was supportive of the commission meeting and deliberating on the results. What would have taken place in the deliberations never became known because we didn't have the deliberation. I said, let the result he was bringing forward be tabled. When that is tabled, then you would have known where I stood in relation to those results.
Did you think the election? Did you think the election was free and fair?
If I think the election was free and fair?
Yeah.
Well, I couldn't think so because I thought that it started off with a list that could not produce a free and fair election. And having looked at all that occurred, based on the evidence at my disposal, I cannot conclude it was free and fair.
But the recount that was done correctly called the statements that was made public at the polling station.
The recount helped me to conclude it wasn't free and fair. What I said, and I have written this and circulated it, the case for a non-declaration. I said that what we should have been doing was not to declare the results in those 47 boxes, to provide for a by-election, because I didn't think that people should have been disenfranchised. What the Lowenfield report did was to say we set aside these results. My position was no, don't set them aside. Have a by-election. Because the other results weren't being queried. It's essentially that area which was being queried, even in terms of the actions that they said Mingo carried out.
So why was the by-election held? Why was not done?
It wasn't agreed to.
Who didn't agree to it?
The commission. My proposition was not agreed to. But my proposition is in black and white and in circulation.
What would you recommend for Region 4? Should it stay one region or should it be broken up into 4 different compartments?
There is no good reason for breaking it up. The breaking up is said to be to make things happen quicker. If that's the reason, then you really need to break up the far-flung regions to make things happen quicker, because that is where we have the delay in terms of the statements reaching GECOM. And the delay is understandable because, for example, in Region 7, you can't move all of those statements of polls to the point where those results are tabulated until overnight.
Okay, so subdivision is one of the solutions. Is the commission going to do that?
It is proposed in RUPA amendments, but only for Region 4. It is not proposed for where that problem really resides.
Okay, and I guess that's all the time we have left, Mr. Alexander. I think we have run out of time. We want to thank you so much. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
Well, I would say in closing that basically where I am at is that GECOM and the nation has not allowed itself a true interrogation of what happened during the 2020 elections. And what we have is finger pointing, and those who are better positioned to act upon their thoughts have done so, but we have not really made an objective determination of what occurred in 2020.
Okay, Dr. Rose, anything in closing?
Yes, I am calling for the retirement age to be increased from 55 to 62 years old. I'm calling for internet providers to provide better internet services for its customers throughout the country. A minimum wage of $125,000 for police, teachers, nurses, and all public servants. And the government should take care of 100% of all centurions in the country.
Great suggestion.
I would like to see happen.
I think I will update minimum wage to at least $1,000 US, which is about 200,000 Guyana dollars, which I think is livable in Guyana. Anyway, to our audience, we want to thank you so much for being part of what? Mr. Alexander, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. To our viewers, I know many questions, they're still unanswered. You know, depending on which side of the political side you are, you agree with Mr. Alexander, you disagree with him. I mean, it's you are to make that call, but we try to give you the answers. I know our guests, we like to expand our answers so that, you know, it takes so much time so we can't get as many questions as we possibly can. But we want to thank you anyway, Mr. Alexander, for being here. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Until the next time, God bless our great country. Happy Holy Week to all our Christians, to the Muslims, to continue Ramadan Mubarak, and of course to the Hindus as they celebrate another auspicious day. Thank you so much, and God bless our great country.